rain that we've had over the last couple of days, because that's, I think, brought some of these pools that we're going to talk about tonight back to life. Let me introduce our speaker tonight. Steve Faccio is a conservation biologist, and he is the co-founder of the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He has wide-ranging interest and skills as a scientist, naturalist, writer, and photographer. He has over 25 years experience. Much of his work at VCE is focused on forest ecology, including long-term population monitoring of forest songbirds, ecology of pool breeding amphibians, and vernal pool mapping and conservation. And I really would invite all of you to check out Steve's videos that I think he made last year, Steve, during lockdown. And you can find those. I just watched them this afternoon. He's got 8 of them, and they're wonderful. 3 2-minute vids of vernal pools. You can find them at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies website, which is Steve, you'll have to tell us.
It's vtecostudies.org.
There you go. And with no further ado, Steve Faccio. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Happy to be here. Also happy that I don't have to drive anywhere tonight in the rain. And as you said, this rain is much needed, really. The pool started out dry this year, and or low anyway. And March was warm, and the beginning of April was warm and dry. So this is much needed rain for the vernal pools. So I'm going to jump right in here. Just give you a little bit of background about VCE, the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. We are a relatively small nonprofit based in Norwich, Vermont, and our mission is to advance wildlife conservation through research, monitoring, and community engagement. And a lot of our projects involve community members as volunteers, whether it be collecting data or helping us to process or analyze data. Whenever we can, we like to involve the community in our work. It's not all of our projects, but a good number of them involve community volunteers. So with that, I'll just start the program. I like to share a little bit about some of the books that I find really helpful on a particular topic, and tonight's about vernal pools. So these are my 2 favorite go-to vernal pool references. The one on the left, Vernal Pools, Natural History and Conservation by Elizabeth Colburn, published in 2004. So it's a little bit dated, but excellent material. It's sort of like an old natural history a book that it's a bit of a lay person, but still has a lot of science in it. Really good information on the invertebrates in vernal pools. Book on the right is more textbook-like, The Science and Conservation of Vernal Pools in Northeastern North America. Takes a much more scientific approach, more of a peer-reviewed kind of approach, and a little more recent. And then this little guide is just fantastic from Massachusetts, a field guide to the animals of vernal pools, full color photographs, and really excellent, small, spiral bound, so it's easy to stay open in the field. And it's really inexpensive, $12 if you get it from the Massachusetts Wildlife Publications. Don't get it on Amazon. It's like $25 on Amazon, but you can get it for $12 from Massachusetts. So those are my 3 favorite references. So just a little outline of what we'll cover tonight. We'll start out by defining what a vernal pool is, go over the basic characteristics, the functions and values of a vernal pool, and then we'll segue into the natural history and ecology of the amphibians that breed in vernal pools. And that's kind of my area of expertise as a wildlife ecologist. I'm not a wetland scientist, but I'm a wildlife ecologist. And then we'll Then we'll finish up with just a little bit of information about some of the conservation issues surrounding vernal pools. And then two of the projects that I'm working on that involve citizens in vernal pools, the Vernal Pool Atlas and our vernal pool monitoring program. So let's begin with what vernal pools are, what their characteristics are. They are small, shallow wetlands that are isolated from permanent wetlands. They're temporary, they're ephemeral. They they tend to fill with spring rain and snowmelt, and then will dry later in the summer. And as I say, they're small and shallow. Those are kind of relative terms. So to look at some real data, out of 574 pools that we visited in Vermont, we estimated the size of those pools. You can see about 2/3 of the pools we visited were less than 1/10 of an acre, and a full 90% of the pools we visited were less than 1/4 acre in size. There are, pools that are quite large, greater than 1/2 acre, up to about an acre, but those are rare and not the norm. So less than 1/4 acre is pretty typical. About 1/10 of an acre is pretty common. And as far as depth goes, most of the pools, about 3/4 of the pools that we visited, are less than 2 feet deep. There are pools that are much deeper. 3 to 4 feet is not terribly uncommon, but it's not the norm. 2 feet is less than 2 feet is pretty typical. And as I mentioned, they're ephemeral. They have a distinct seasonal hydrology, filling with spring rains and snow melt. And then as the growing season progresses, there's evaporation, and the pools begin to shrink in size. And then usually by the end of the summer, many pools have dried up completely. And what the importance of that is that it inhibits fish populations from becoming established in these pools. Some pools may only dry in drought years. Some pools may dry every year. But that drying is critical to the survival particularly of the amphibians that breed in these pools. These amphibians evolved breeding in these temporary waters. They have no defenses against predatory fish populations. Their eggs and their larvae would be wiped out pretty quickly by fish, whereas pond breeding amphibians like bullfrogs or pickerel frogs or green frogs or newts, for that matter, are toxic. Their eggs are toxic, their larvae are toxic, and fish quickly learn not to eat them. But these vernal pool species don't have those defenses. In order for a vernal pool to provide the habitat necessary for amphibians, it has to remain flooded for 3 months. For wood frogs, 3 months after they lay their eggs, they need about 3 months to be successful in their reproduction, for those larvae, those tadpoles, to develop and leave the pool as little tiny frogs. And even longer for salamanders. Salamanders need about 4 months, give or take a week or two. And generally, the longer the hydro period, the longer the period that it holds water, the greater the species diversity that will be there. And that's true for the amphibian as well as for the invertebrates, which is where the real diversity lies among vernal pool species, is in the invertebrate population. There's probably hundreds of species of invertebrates that colonize these vernal pools. There's only a few species of amphibians that really depend on them. And what will the effects of climate change be on vernal pools? Well, we don't know, obviously, but the climate change scenarios suggest that we're going to have, warmer temperatures, warmer summers, with more severe storms, but there'll be long dry periods between storms. So it's really going to depend on when those severe storms occur. If they occur at the right time in April and May, things might be great for vernal pools. But if April and May are pretty dry, and we don't get severe storms till the end of the summer, that could severely impact the viability of vernal pools. They also provide critical habitat for these species I've been talking about, invertebrates and amphibians, a whole suite of invertebrates and a handful of amphibians that really depend on these temporary waters for some portion of their life cycle. And it's also quite unusual in that vernal pools are really defined by their animal communities more than it is their plant communities. They really don't have distinct plant communities. They really, unlike most other natural communities we think of things like red maple swamps or sedge meadows or spruce fir forests or beech maple forests. They're defined by the community of plants that are growing there. Vernal pools don't have a distinct community of plants. So it's really defined by those characteristics we talked about: small basin, no connections to permanent wetlands, no permanent inlets or outlets, and then the animal community that makes up the fauna there. And the more ecologists have studied vernal pools, the more we've come to realize that they are really keystone ecosystems. They have a much greater influence on the surrounding forest, the surrounding landscape, than you would expect based on their small size and their ephemeral nature. And one of the best illustrations of this is a study that was done in Massachusetts by Brian Windmiller during his PhD work down at Tufts, where as part of his PhD work, he estimated the biomass of all breeding birds, all the small mammals, and 7 species of pool breeding amphibians in a 53-acre forest surrounding the single vernal pool in Concord, Massachusetts. And then beyond that 53-acre forest was urban development. Lots of roads, lots of development. So this was a really isolated pool. And here's what he came up with: the biomass for all these groups of animals. For birds, he came up with 13 pounds of birds living in this 50-acre forest. 108 pounds of small mammals, and if I remember correctly, that was squirrels and smaller. So squirrels and chipmunks and mice and shrews, things like that, bats. And then for amphibians, if I can have a drum roll, please, Steve. Amphibians, 271 pounds of amphibians. More amphibians than mammals and birds put together.
Woohoo!
Yeah, and that is has a big influence on the energy flow from that aquatic system into the surrounding forest. All those little frogs and salamanders that are leaving the pool at the end of the summer is a huge amount of food and a big impact on the food web. And I kind of think of especially little wood froglets, these little metamorphs. When they leave the pool, they're tiny, and they're kind of like the Cheez-Its of the amphibian world. Everybody loves them. There's a lot of wildlife that depend on these small froglets that leave the pools for food: turkeys, grouse, lots of amphibians. In fact, a lot of frogs will eat them, as well as snakes and birds. Garter snakes are one of the biggest predators of these vernal pool amphibians. Raccoons spend a lot of time foraging around the edges of vernal pools, as well as barred owls. Probably the most common predator I see at vernal pools this time of year are barred owls, particularly when the wood frogs are breeding and calling. It's like the dinner bell for barred owls. And I don't think it's any coincidence that barred owls tend to have their young hatch right about the time that the vernal pools become active in the spring. There's a flush of readily available food to feed those hungry mouths in the nest. the Fu Manchu of a wood frog going down. And the wildlife that we find in these vernal pools are dependent on forested habitat surrounding the pool. And the pool itself is really dependent on forest as well, because the annual input of leaves from the forest into the pool provides the basis of the food chain in a vernal pool. So the leaf litter on the bottom of the pool feeds species like caddisfly larvae and isopods, two of the more abundant invertebrates, macroinvertebrates in these vernal pools. And they feed by shredding up the leaf litter on the bottom of the pools. And by shredding up those leaves, it facilitates the formation of something called periphyton. And if we ignore the beautiful spotted salamander egg mass in the middle of the photo and kind of look around on the leaf litter, and you might see that sort of gray fuzz that's growing on the leaf litter and on the sticks. That's periphyton, and it's a nutrient-rich, complex mixture of bacteria and fungi and algae and detritus and phytoplankton that is fed upon by a lot of the invertebrates, as well as wood frog tadpoles in vernal pools. And it's really rich in nutrients, and it's the primary food source for a lot of these species. One of the more really interesting and beautiful invertebrates that we find in some vernal pools are fairy shrimp. We don't know a lot about the ecology of fairy shrimp. They're really quite just not a lot we know about them. They reach about 3/4 of an inch long. This appears to be the most common species we have in Vermont, the knob-lipped fairy shrimp, Eubranchopus bundii. We probably have at least one, maybe two other species in Vermont. They spend their entire lives in a single vernal pool. They have no way of dispersing themselves. They have no flighted stage or terrestrial stage where they can move from one pool to another. They hatch in the early spring. They go through a couple of instars, like growth periods, until they reach full size, like this one. Then they mate. The female lays eggs. The eggs float to the bottom of the pool, and the adults die quickly thereafter. So their lifespan might be 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks at the most. And their eggs can be viable for decades in a pool, and their eggs won't start developing until they've undergone freezing and a drying period. So the pool has to dry out and then be exposed to freezing temperatures before those fairy shrimp will hatch and become active. But they can last for decades in the bottom of a pool. And probably the two most likely scenarios for how they get dispersed from pool to pool is either by wind. They can be picked up from a dry pool and be scattered in the wind, their eggs, or their eggs can be ingested by waterfowl that are feeding on periphyton or algae from the bottom of the pool and travel right through the waterfowl's gut and be excreted into another pool and still be viable. There have been studies where they've looked at that process, fed them to ducks, and they're still viable after passing through their digestive tract. Beautiful little animals. And as I said, we don't know a lot about the species we have in Vermont or their distribution. I'm beginning to start to piece those things together. Here are the pools we know have fairy shrimp in Vermont. And since I've made this slide, we've found a few others, but not every vernal pool has them. And as I alluded to in the description of their life cycle, they may be present in a pool one year and not the next because their eggs need to freeze and dry out. I was just at a pool today that had abundant fairy shrimp, just thousands and thousands of them. And to give you a little glimpse into the underwater world of a vernal pool and fairy shrimp, we'll show you this this little underwater video. And I apologize for the shakiness at the beginning, but it'll settle down in a second. So we're seeing the orange animals you see are the fairy shrimp with the white tipped tails. But we're also seeing mosquito larvae that are kind of vertical and wriggling around. And then you might notice some very small whitish creatures swimming around. Those are either copepods or daphnia, really abundant, that are important food sources for salamander larvae. All right, get out of here, move to the next. All right, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the pool breeding amphibians. These are the 4 species in Vermont that are really dependent on vernal pools. From the left, the spotted salamander, the blue spotted salamander in the center, Jefferson salamander on the right, and then the wood frog is the only real frog species that's dependent on vernal pools. And all these species can breed in other types of wetlands as long as there's either shallow areas where fish really can't access, or wetlands that don't have other types of wetlands that don't have fish populations. So some swamps, things like that don't have predatory fish populations. But vernal pools are really critical for their survival. And in many cases, if you eliminate vernal pools from a local area, you may be eliminating populations of some of these amphibians too, if they can't find other places to breed. So we'll start with the poster child of vernal pools, the spotted salamander. Really engaging animal, very common. As with all of these, it arrives at vernal pools in the spring after a rainy spring night like tonight, where the temperatures are above freezing. They won't move if the ground is dry, unlike wood frogs. The ground needs to be wet for them to migrate, and they'll only migrate at night. So they move from the uplands where they've overwintered in tunnels below the frost line, and they move into the vernal pools. Sometimes there's still snow, patches of snow on the ground, or sometimes there's still ice on the pool. This year, we did not get a warm enough rainy night for spotted salamanders to move until about a week ago, at least where I am. So they moved rather late. The males typically arrive first. They form these groups, sort of communal masses of males in the pool, just a writhing ball of dozens of spotted salamanders. These are called congresses. And they wait for the females. Sometimes the females arrive later the same night. Sometimes it might be a day or two later. Once the female arrives, she chooses a male, and the male and the female will move away from the congress. The male will then deposit these spermatophores. They're little packages of jelly with small packets of sperm on the top. And they're often just scattered on the bottom of the pool like this, although sometimes they're attached to sticks like this. And then the female will take 1 or 2 of those sperm packets into her body through her cloaca, and the eggs are fertilized inside. And then a day or so later, she will deposit her eggs. And each spotted salamander, spotted salamander eggs are on the left. She can lay 1 to 3 egg masses, and each might contain anywhere from 30 to 250 eggs. And just for comparison, the Jefferson salamander eggs are much smaller, might only contain anywhere from 5 to 30 or so eggs in a single egg mass. So the reproductive output is pretty significant for spotted salamanders. They can produce a lot of eggs, and their egg masses are quite large, almost around baseball size, and pretty firm outer jelly matrix that surrounds it. After they lay eggs, they leave the pools back into the forest, where they spend the rest of the year in small mammal tunnels. They don't dig their own tunnels. there's a there's an interesting relationship between these mole salamanders and small mammals that dig the burrows that they live in. So these are things like short-tailed shrew burrows, meadow vole tunnels, and mouse tunnels, particularly white-footed deer mouse and jumping mice. And as well as they'll also live in chipmunk burrows too. As I mentioned, these are widely distributed throughout eastern North America, from, as you can see, from the Gulf Coast up to southern Canada, primarily east of the Great Plains. And in Vermont, they're quite common and widespread, although they are considered a medium priority species of greatest conservation need. And that's primarily because they need these ephemeral wetlands for part of their life cycle, to complete their life cycle. So if we don't have vernal pools on the landscape, well, they would lose most of their breeding sites. And then we move on to these two these two species, the blue spotted salamander on the left and the Jefferson salamander on the right. Closely related, the blue spotted salamander is more of a Midwestern species, really. And its stronghold in Vermont is really the Champlain Valley, although it's found elsewhere, but it's primarily a lowland valley species. Not a species I would expect to find in Londonderry, I don't believe. Jefferson salamander is more of an upland. Large percentage of its population occurs in the northeastern US. And it's out of all of the vernal pool amphibian species, this is the one that's probably the most limited to breeding in vernal pools. And it also appears to be somewhat sensitive to habitat fragmentation, more so than the blue spotted. And their ranges in Vermont, blue spotted is again considered a medium priority species of greatest conservation need, while the Jefferson salamander is considered a high priority species of greatest conservation need. It's probably because it's more dependent on vernal pools than blue spotteds, which will breed in lots of large wetlands that you find in the Champlain Valley, some of those large wetland complexes like Cornwall Swamp and Brandon Swamps and things like that. And then we have this really, really unusual situation going on with these species. They have these unisexual populations that consist entirely of females. And this arose millions of years ago through an ancestral hybridization event between 5 different species. And in this region of the country, we only have 2 of the 5 species, blue spotted and Jefferson. If you go into the Midwest, there are all 5 of those species. But here we have this unique complex. These unisexual populations are all female, and they reproduce through gynogenesis. It's a completely different reproductive strategy. It's not sexual reproduction, but they do need sperm from a male to activate their eggs to develop, but none of the genetic material from the father is incorporated into the eggs. So all of the offspring are clones of the mother. But somewhere along the line, and this still occurs sometimes, the genome from the male is incorporated into the eggs, but not the genetic material, just the genome, and they're still all females, but they can have multiple sets of chromosomes. So they can take on, their appearance can range from looking a bit like a blue spotted to a mix in between, or a bit like a Jefferson. And so they share these characteristics depending on how much genetic material from which species they have. So they can have 2 sets of chromosomes like normal reproduction. They can have 3, they can have 4, they can have 5 sets of chromosomes. Very unusual. It's fascinating. I could probably do an hour-long talk just on this topic. That's really all I have time to go into tonight, but really fascinating. So we'll move on to to the wood frog. This is the only frog species that's really dependent on vernal pools. There are other frogs that will breed in vernal pools, particularly spring peepers and gray tree frogs. This is a frog that spends most of its life in the forest habitats around these breeding pools, just like the salamanders. Widely distributed in Vermont, virtually in every town, and will breed in a variety of wetlands, from beaver ponds and swamps to vernal pools. But again, they need to have protection from fish predation. Its range goes the furthest north of any frog species beyond the Arctic Circle. Pretty remarkable for an amphibian to live that far north, where there's permafrost and a very short growing season. And we're going to listen to a short video. It's about a 4 or 5 minute video about how it's able to overwinter in those kind of harsh conditions.
Here's the thing about North American wood frogs. They're small.
So it might be very difficult to spot a frog.
Very small, but they're everywhere, just out of view, hiding on the forest floor.
Nothing. He's camouflaged. His coloration is the same as the soil around him. You see him here? He's cold.
You can find them here in southern Ohio and all the way up to the Arctic Circle. But wherever they are, once it gets cold with the first sprinkle of ice, this frog does something I didn't know was possible. As soon as the frog just touches an ice crystal,
This animal is going to freeze.
freeze?
Freeze. Solid freeze.
That touch of ice immediately sets off signals inside the frog, says Professor John Costanzo, that pulls water away from the center of its body, so the frog's internal organs are now wrapped in a puddle of water that then turns to solid ice.
I still can't get over it. It's really an amazing thing.
There is no breathing, no kidney function. The heart stops.
And there'll be no heartbeat for a long period of time.
You mean as in no heartbeat?
Right.
Nothing.
Flatline.
Flatline. For an hour or two?
It could be for days, perhaps even weeks.
Really? It sounds like it's virtually dead, no?
We know that the frog isn't dead, but he's probably about as close as you can get.
To being dead.
Yes.
So, from the outside, this little frog feels like a rock. Except that as it froze, the frog flooded itself with a kind of sugar.
The frog's blood sugar is distributed through the circulatory system. It works like an antifreeze.
It's harder for the water to freeze, so cells stay just damp enough for the animal to hold itself together. Until the springtime, when the days grow a little longer and the ground gets a little warmer. And then, well, a kind of miracle happens. After weeks or months of no heartbeat, none, suddenly there's a pulse. And that first heartbeat leads to another, and then another. And then within a day, and in the case of this little frog, it took about 10 hours, the animal literally comes back to life.
Spontaneous resumption of function.
Why?
We don't know. We don't know what triggers that event.
And think how elegant a business this is. Because although the sun is warming up the outside of this little guy, somehow his insides, his heart, his brain, they thaw first. His insides warm up before his outsides. But somehow it all happens in perfect synchrony every spring.
Pretty remarkable stuff. And what amazes me just as much is to think about what the frog does immediately after he resumes function. He gains function. And comes to life in the spring. He doesn't, take his time and do a little feeding after being frozen solid all winter. No, he migrates immediately to vernal pools that have just thawed, jumps into the ice cold water, and gets busy with the process of breeding. And you're probably all familiar with the sound of wood frogs. A quack-like call that they make. So they're explosive breeders. They arrive at the pool as soon as the females arrive. The males are on them. They're ready to mate, and they're so anxious to mate they will sometimes grab the wrong species, or sometimes grab a male instead of a male wood frog. And so the males have a release call that tells the male on their back to, beat it. Tadpoles are not going to be the result of this union. So unlike salamanders, which have internal fertilization, frogs have external fertilization. So the male, which tends to be smaller than the females are often this reddish orange color. They're swollen with eggs. The male will grab the female, hold on in the what's called amplexus, and wait for the female to begin laying the eggs. And she has a particular vibration that she gives when she's laying the eggs, so the male knows. And at the same time, he releases his sperm into the water, and the eggs are fertilized externally in the water. They often lay their eggs in these communal masses. Often it's the sunniest part of the pool, which tends to be the warmest, and which is often the north end of the pool, because the sun is shining through the open canopy from the south. The north edge of the pool often is often the most sunniest. That's often where you'll find the wood frog eggs in a cluster, and they pretty quickly will develop and hatch into tadpoles. And it's pretty easy to distinguish between these four species that we've been talking about. If we start with the wood frog at the bottom right, wood frog eggs don't have an external surrounding matrix of jelly. They just, each embryo or egg is encased in a little jelly capsule, and then they're just sort of glommed together. There's no outer jelly holding them all together. So they're a little fragile. They look kind of lumpy like tapioca, and they are a bit fragile. If you pick them up, they can sort of fall apart. So you have to be very careful if you handle wood frog eggs. Next to it on the left, spotted salamander eggs, about the same size, but they are surrounded with that jelly matrix, outer jelly matrix that's very firm, like Jello. And then above it, the Jefferson salamander egg mass, which is quite small, difficult to see. The jelly is very loose, more like jelly, or a little bit runnier. And as I said, they tend to be quite small. And then the blue spotted eggs, they're the ones that are hard to find. They're often laid singly on the bottom of the pool, sometimes in clusters of 2 or 3, like this. And if you happen to have populations of unisexuals, you often see a high proportion of dead embryos in the unisexual egg masses. So the white embryos in these egg masses are all dead. And why that is occurring, no one knows at this point. We don't know if it's sperm limitation, because those unisexuals are essentially stealing sperm from males, but they're only producing females, so they outnumber the pure populations almost 2 to 1 in most pools. So it could be sperm limitation, or it could be some genetic mix-up that's going on because of the mixed genomes that these species are carrying. And there's a really unique algae that grows in these egg masses. After a week or so in the water, you'll start to see this greenish cast on the egg masses. And it's an algae that is only found in these amphibian egg masses. And it's actually been found inside the bodies of spotted salamanders. The first case ever where there's been a photosynthesizing green plant growing inside of a vertebrate's body. Nobody knows why that's occurring yet. There's no evidence that the female is passing the algae on to her offspring in the egg mass. When the egg masses are first laid, there's no algae in them. It's colonized later. So that's not happening, but somehow the algae is actually inside the spotted salamanders. I don't think anyone's found it inside of wood frogs or Jefferson salamanders at this point, but it does colonize their egg masses. A little bit about their larva. So on the top, we have spotted salamander larva. Easy to distinguish in that they have the big feathery gills. These guys are predators.
Holy cow, this is so fucking.
They feed only on other animals, invertebrates, very small invertebrates to begin with, moving on to larger things. These all suffer high mortality, roughly 60 to 70% do not survive. And it takes them about 3 months to metamorphose. So that's from hatching to metamorphosis. Wood frogs, classic tadpole shape. They have internal gills. They don't have the big feathery gills. And they take around about 2 months or so to metamorphosis. And these guys are already hatching. So their eggs were laid in the first week of April here in my area. And the tadpoles are hatching, have been hatching this week. So once they metamorphose towards the end of the summer, July or August, depending on the species and the pool, they move out into the surrounding forest, just like their parents. Wood frogs have a fairly short lifespan. Those, they're sexually mature in generally the males are in a year. Females typically take 2 years. And if a female breeds twice, that's probably a long life for them. Salamanders, on the other hand, are long-lived. So spotted salamanders are known to live at least 20 to 25 years. So much different strategy. Their larvae take 4 to 5 years to reach sexual maturity. And during that stage of their life, they are dispersing. They're wandering the landscape and dispersing away from the pools where they were born. So they colonize, new sites. So there's genetic exchange between pools. They don't return to the pool in which they were born. You hear that a lot about about vernal pools, but that's not the case. A small percentage might, but the vast majority are hardwired to disperse away. So let's talk a little bit about some of the conservation issues surrounding vernal pools. The first thing is the need to just protect these breeding pools. Obviously, they're critical for this life, for these animals to complete their life cycle. They're just breeding pools. It's not where these animals live. It's just the breeding pools where the larvae develop before moving out into the surrounding forest. And here's a kind of a classic example of why we need to know where these pools are on the landscape. This is a color infrared aerial photograph taken in 1991. And this happens to be in Londonderry, by the way. Just happens that way. I've used this slide for years. In an infrared photograph, anything red is actively photosynthesizing. So those are conifer stands, the red areas. The grayish areas are hardwood forests. And right in the center of the screen, you see a perfect photo signature for a vernal pool. It has no streams leading in or out of it. It's black water on a color infrared aerial photo shows up as black. So that's a classic signature of a vernal pool. And if we look at this same aerial photo, a more recent aerial photo from 2016, we now see that that vernal pool is gone. It's been developed with a house and a couple of barns. So it's really critical that we know where they are in the landscape so that we can take steps to conserve them and protect them. When they're dry, they can be pretty difficult if you're not tuned into it to realize what it is, to realize that that's a vernal pool. It might just look like a dry depression in the forest. It's covered with leaf litter, might be a little muddy, but hard to realize. So in addition to protecting the breeding pools and mapping where they are, we also need to think about the forest surrounding those pools and think about, how we manage the forest and use best management practices, or BMPs. So a research project I did about 20 years ago where I radio tagged salamanders to find out how big of an area do they use around a vernal pool? How far do they move away from a pool after breeding? And I determined that they move about 600 feet. They stay within roughly 600 feet of vernal pools. That's their life zone. That's where they stay. So it's important to consider that 600-foot life zone when you're doing forestry practices or other types of management in a forest around a vernal pool. And there's some really great best management practices. I'm just going to touch on some really obvious things. You want to protect the vernal pool basin. You don't want to disturb it. You don't want to drive skidders through it or any kind of machinery or ATVs, because you can damage the impervious layer that's holding the water in. You could puncture that and it could drain out from then on. Within the 100-foot buffer, you should have a really light touch in any kind of forestry. That's kind of protects the water quality, and you shouldn't cut trees that are right around the edge of the pool. And then within that life zone, you want to maintain at least a 55% canopy cover, because these amphibians are really they can dry out very easily if too much sun reaches the forest floor during the summer when it's hot. So you want to maintain some canopy cover and leaf litter on the forest floor. And only do any harvesting on frozen ground to avoid creating big ruts and disturbing the forest floor. So on our website, if you're interested in more information about best management practices, we have these two. The publication on the left from Maine is really detailed, and then I have just a very cursory 2-page document that sort of summarizes a lot of this information about management. All right, and lastly, we want to maintain forested connection between vernal pools. We want to avoid isolating pools from other pools, because as I was talking about the genetic exchange between pools, those young animals need to disperse into the surrounding landscape and find new pools where they'll breed once they become adults. But they need to be able to reach those other pools. If there's inhospitable habitat in between, whether it's developments or highways, it's going to limit that ability to move and reduce the genetic diversity of metapopulations. So this illustrates that kind of thing. So think about these 5 pools in a forested landscape, and the 2 pools that are on the bottom. The distance between those 2 lower pools is too far for any of those salamanders to migrate that complete distance. But there's genetic exchange because of the pools in between those lower pools. So they can sort of hopscotch between pools over a couple generations, and eventually there's genetic exchange between all 5 pools. But imagine what happens if you put a road through and destroy those 2 middle pools and isolate that 1 pool on the far right. That pool can no longer have genetic exchange with any of these other pools. And over time, that pool will just lose genetic diversity of those populations, And eventually over probably, a couple hundred years, will start to wink out, and it will no longer be viable. And finally, I'll just finish up by mentioning two projects that I have going on that involve volunteers to help us. One is the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, or the VP Atlas. This is an outgrowth of the Vernal Pool Mapping Project that occurred from about 2003 to, I don't remember, 2015 or something. It's an interactive database, online database that compiles and archives data about vernal pools across Vermont. And you can add data to it. You can visit a pool and add what you found. You can add new pools that we don't have on the atlas yet. We certainly don't have all the pools that exist. We probably have, I would guess, less than a quarter of the pools that are found in the state. And just for fun, I zoomed in on Londonderry to see what we have mapped in Londonderry. The orange circles are potential pools. These are pools that we located during our mapping project remotely, looking at those color infrared aerial photographs. The blue triangles are the confirmed pools. Those are the pools that have been visited on the ground and confirmed as vernal pools. So there's only one in Londonderry. So it would be a big help to get out in the field and add some data to these pools that are existing. And I'm sure there are more than what we have mapped for Londonderry right now. So add any new pools that don't exist on the atlas. And lastly, the Vernal Pool Monitoring Project, or VP-MON. And that's a project where teams of volunteers adopt the vernal pool. They go out to it 3 or 4 times during the course of the year and collect specific data about what species are there, count egg masses, see if fairy shrimp are present, and so forth. And we deploy some automatic recording devices to record when the frogs are calling, so we can look at the phenology when the frogs start calling. We can look at effects of climate change, see if frogs are calling sooner. We put out some data loggers that record temperature in the water, so we can accurately record when the pool dries out each year, and look at the hydro period. So that's the Vernal Pool Monitoring Project. And that's it. And I'll be happy to take some time to answer questions if you have any.
Well, thank you, Steve. And there are going to be a lot of questions. I've got quite a few myself. Let's start with the ones in the chat. First of all, we have a question from Dory, who wants to know how do the salamanders that you have discussed relate to the orange newts that we see at Lowell Lake?
Yep. Newts are a type of salamander. They go through two metamorphoses. So they're primarily breeding in permanent ponds or wetlands or lakes, like you described at Lowell Lake. That's where the adults breed, lay their eggs. The larvae hatch, develop in the pools. They have those big feathery gills like you saw in the photograph with the spotted salamander larva. Then they metamorphose into red Fs, which are the bright orange that you might see wandering around on the trails or on the landscape. So that's a terrestrial stage that might last anywhere from 2 to 4 years. And then they metamorphose again into the adult form. They still breathe with lungs as adults, but they're primarily aquatic. You can find newts in vernal pools. They usually don't breed in vernal pools because generally the hydro period, the length of time that vernal pools hold water, isn't long enough for successful reproduction. But young adults often spend a couple years in vernal pools because they're rich food sources. They're feeding on wood frog egg masses. They're feeding on newly hatched tadpoles, a lot of the invertebrates. And then when the pool dries out, the adults will either move to a nearby wetland or pond, or they may just hunker down under the leaf litter and wait for the pool to reflood later in the fall.
Okay, and then Esther would like to know what is the size of the Jefferson salamander?
They're a little bit, if you're familiar with spotted salamanders, they're a little bit smaller than spotteds. They'll typically be 5 to 6 inches long as an adult. They, like all salamanders, they do continue to grow through their whole life. So if you find an exceptionally older one, it can be bigger than that. It might be 7 or 8 inches long at probably the max, but they're not quite as chunky or as large as spotted salamander, a little bit smaller.
I've got a bunch of questions. First of all, we dug a pond a few years ago, and it's in full sun and not real deep, so fish don't do too well in there. Interestingly, the first year that it filled up just incredibly with eggs. I don't know where they came from or how they knew that it was there, but these guys found that pond right away and we started having life. But because we've never had a successful fish population in this pond, yet it's there all year round, is it a vernal pool?
It's not from a natural community perspective, it's not a vernal pool. It's functioning. One of its functions is serving, it's functioning like a vernal pool. It's serving some of the same functions for some of the amphibians that are breeding there. And that's not unusual. It's providing what we might call vernal pool habitat for these guys, as long as fish don't become established, or then it could become a population sink if fish were to become established.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable how quickly they can find those dug ponds. It just takes a couple of wood frogs to end up in the water and start singing, and it brings the others in.
By the way, one year I came across what I think was a wood frog in a stump, and he seemed to be locked in. He seemed to be incarcerated, as if he grew within that little cavity, and there didn't seem to be any way he can get out of there. He was just stuck in this little hole in a stump. Have you seen anything like that?
Well, I have fairly frequently see great tree frogs in cavities of trees. Not wood frogs, and I'm not sure how it would have got. I mean, was there there was a hole in it that went into the stump? Is that what or was it like falling over?
Yeah, I could just see his face. I couldn't see any other way in or out, as if he got in there and then grew and filled out the space.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm guessing they can. I mean, they can squeeze through pretty small spaces, so maybe there was a larger opening somewhere that was a little harder to see.
Okay, but you've talked about the value of vernal ponds in the ecosystem. Is there any value to actually artificially building vernal ponds?
There can be. The risk that you take with building ponds, and I've seen this a number of times, is that they often wind up being population sinks, because it can be a little tricky to get the hydro period right. So if the hydro period is too short or too long, and fish wind up getting in there, then it's a population sink, right? The frogs don't know that it's not going to be a successful place. They show up, they do their thing, they lay the eggs, but there's no reproductive success. So it's kind of a sink. You're attracting the animals to it, but they're not getting any benefit from it. That's the one risk, you take by building vernal pools. There are some people who have gotten pretty good at it, and there are plenty of guidelines for how to do it. The critical thing is getting that hydro period, so it's at least 3 months long after ice out. 4 months is even better, and that there's a drying out period, so that it doesn't fish can't get established. I think the most useful use of that is in mitigation. So if there's a project that destroys a vernal pool, then, it's kind of a last ditch effort to kind of make up for that. If you can't avoid destroying the pool, then maybe try creating one instead.
Okay, here's a question from Mary Beth, who says, I do wetland delineations in Vermont, and I'm wondering what the best ways are to identify vernal pools versus depressions later in the summer and fall. Can you share tips? Beyond evidence of wet leaves, what have you noticed about soils or plants?
Yeah, because there really aren't any distinctive plants. Sometimes there are, sedges, and there's typically a lack of woody vegetation growing in a dry vernal pool. So, usually in the forest, you'll have some saplings or seedlings of woody vegetation starting. But because it's inundated for, a good part of the year, those woody seedlings typically don't get started. So that's one clue to look for in a depression. If there's no seedlings, woody vegetation seedlings. Sometimes there are sedges. And the other thing you can do is look for fingernail clams, which are these tiny little clams that are pretty common in vernal pools, and you can find them in the dry basin. Sometimes it takes a fair amount of searching, digging through some of the muck and the mud, the dry soil, but they're anywhere from an 1/8 of an inch in diameter to maybe up to 1/4 of an inch, and they're not common in acidic soils. So if you have really coniferous stands, you're probably not going to find many fingernail clams. But if you have any more rich sites, more limey sites, sweet sites, then you'll find fingernail clams. That's a good thing to key in on. Good question. Yeah.
Steve, go ahead.
Steve, I guess about a month ago, or late March, early April, there was a spot depression along the West River Trail along the river in Londonderry that was just full of peepers and wood frogs. And in years past, it's been very viable. Then we had that 3-week dry up in April, and it completely dried, and there were masses of eggs that were just dry. And now we've had this rain. So my question is, can a vernal pool go through a wet, dry, and the eggs be viable, or no? They have to have that wet.
They can if it's relatively short.
Okay.
3 weeks, not likely that's going to stay viable. But if it's if it's a couple of days, they might stay hydrated enough, especially those embryos that are in the center of the egg mass. And if it's a communal egg mass, I didn't mention this, but those communal egg masses of wood frogs, where that's a big floating mat, sometimes they can be as big as a desktop or bigger, dining room table size of all wood frog eggs, and those eggs that are in the middle can stay hydrated for several days. If a pool dries out and then refloods, and also be protected from freezing in the center. So it not only serves as a protection from predators in the middle, but protection from dehydration and freezing as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question from Peter. Peter, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Peter. Good to see you.
I have, I'm really interested in trying to figure out this whole Jefferson complex egg mass thing. And so I was up at my vernal pool today, and I was looking at egg masses, and I identified, some egg masses that had a lot of those opaque white spots in them. So I'm wondering, in those egg masses, is there a percentage of viability, or in terms of, how many of those eggs might actually come to fruition in that complex?
Well, the white eggs you see, those are not, obviously those are dead. Those are not hatching. Yeah. What we don't know is whether those were just not activated by sperm, or is there some genetic mix-up that causes that? Generally, when you see populations with those fairly high proportion of in viable eggs. It's usually like 60%, 70% of the eggs are not viable. It's a
Right.
pretty high proportion.
Yeah.
From the papers I've read, I haven't actually gone out and done counts to determine that, but from the papers I've read from others who have looked at it, it's a fairly high proportion.
Right.
And whether that's still those populations are still female biased. If you look at the numbers of females to males, generally in a typical spotted salamander population, the males outnumber females, at least in a breeding pool. The males outnumber females not quite 2 to 1. Sometimes it's 1.5 to 1. And that's because females don't breed every year. So there's more females in the population. They're taking a year off.
Right.
But with the Jeffersons, it's usually 2.5 females for every male.
Right.
And that's just because of that. The unisexuals are pumping out all females, and all those females can pump out all females. So it's this this effect that just sort of eliminates. Eventually, it seems like it's a ecological dead end for the pure populations.
Right. Right.
But they've been around for millions of years, so it's working.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's fascinating to me is that, this year, looking in the 2 pools that I've been looking at, in many more, and this could just be the nights that I went out, but many more Jeffersons that I counted this year than Spotteds. And I don't know why that is, but maybe it was just dumb luck or the nights I was there, but it certainly was very pronounced this year.
Yeah. Jeffersons do seem to be a little more cold tolerant. And they typically move early, and the first rains that we had, it turned to snow later in the night. So,
Right.
Jeffersons moved on those nights, but not many Spotteds did. The Spotteds are still moving. Jeffersons are done, and their eggs are close to hatching. Whereas I'm still seeing Spotteds in the pools. So, it's been a very unusual spring, started so early.
Yeah.
But, the Spotteds are just breeding now, and it's late April, almost May, right? So crazy. Totally, their breeding cycle is completely driven by the weather. So it's different every year, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Sure.
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you very much, Steve, for this presentation tonight. For those of you who are interested, and I hope you all are, in the chat, I have placed the link for the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and they do quite a lot more than vernal pools. I hope you'll take a look at what they do and support what they do. They've certainly over the years done a lot for the Londonderry Conservation Commission in our educational outreach. And once again, this program, as well as all of our other ones, are available on our YouTube channel. And you can find the link to our YouTube channel in the same place where you found the link for tonight's presentation. So once again, thank you, all of you who came with us tonight. Steve, you have a word for us?
Just one more word. Thank you so much, Steve, for your great presentation. Our next Londonderry Conservation Commission presentation, I would like to remind folks, will be about a Vermont lady beetle atlas. This will occur on May 27th, 7 p.m. by Julia Pupko. So we're going to learn about ladybugs and lady beetles in May 27th. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh,
Thanks a lot.
all right. Well, thanks again, Steve.
Sure.
And thanks for a great program. Thank you all for coming this evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.